The longship scraped against the stony shore, its dragon prow glaring into the grey dawn. 30 Norse warriors leapt into the surf, shields high, blades eager. They had come to Vendland for the same reason they raided everywhere else: easy plunder, helpless villages, slaves to carry home. Their Jarl had promised silver, cattle, and glory. The burning smell of some distant settlement drifted faintly on the wind, as if confirming those promises. Yet the forest beyond the strand loomed dark and patient, its mist curling like breath from the mouth of some hidden beast. This was the beginning of Wends versus Vikings, the Slavic warriors who fought back. And it began not with triumph, but with silence. The men moved inland, their mail rattling softly, their boots sinking into damp soil. No birds called, no dogs barked, even the wind seemed to hold its breath. A seasoned raider muttered that the woods were cursed. Another spat, gripping his axe tighter. They had seen silence before, in Ireland, in Frisia, in the Isles of the North. But never like this, never a silence that felt alive, as though the forest itself were watching. Then it came, a low howl, deep and mournful. Not wolf, not man, something between. From the shadows another answered, closer. The warriors froze, hearts pounding, as the forest floor shifted. A man screamed, vanishing into a pit lined with sharpened stakes. The crunch of bones and gurgle of blood silenced him, and before his death cry faded, arrows hissed from the mist. They were not the wild volleys of desperate peasants, but the careful, deadly rain of trained bowmen. Shafts tipped with fire clung to cloaks and mail, searing flesh. 3 Norsemen fell in moments, writhing as their comrades scrambled to form a shield wall. Figures stepped from behind the trees, tall men with faces painted in white and red spirals, cloaked in wolf pelts with snarling heads still attached. They moved as if they were part of the forest, their steps silent, their eyes gleaming with something colder than hatred. A horn bellowed, low and resonant, and with it the woods erupted. More warriors appeared, more wolves loosed from leather cords, their yellow eyes burning in the gloom. The Norse found themselves surrounded, their famed ferocity swallowed by tactics they did not understand. Axes clashed against curved spears, unlike any they had seen, blades serrated to tear through flesh and bone, shields splintered under stone-headed clubs. A masked giant, his face carved from wood and marked with runes that seemed to shift in the light, strode forward with the authority of a chieftain and a priest. His wolves strained at their leash, jaws snapping for Norse throats. He spoke in a tongue like grinding stone, but his meaning was clear: you will not take this land. And so, in the depths of the Wendish forest, the hunters became the hunted. What the Vikings thought were scattered tribes were warriors born of earth and mist, defenders who would not kneel. The Norse had met their match, and their worst nightmares had only just begun. The skalds sang endlessly of Norsemen, of dragon-proud ships and gold taken in fire, of kings who carved kingdoms from the sea. Yet silence hangs heavy when the tale turns to the Wends, as if ink itself recoiled from their memory. These Slavic warriors of the southern Baltic were the enemy the sagas forgot, a people who stood not as victims, but as scourges, who turned forest and swamp into weapons sharper than steel. Their story lingers not in verse, but in the bones beneath ruined fortresses and the whispers of old chronicles written by their foes. Their land stretched wide, where sea met river and marsh. From the Elbe in the west to the Oder in the east, the Wends ruled forests so thick they blotted out the sun, and wetlands that swallowed whole armies. Unlike the scattered isles and fjords of the Northmen, this was a boundless wall of earth and water, a homeland designed for defence. Within it rose the Grodai circular fortresses ringed with palisades, ditches and water, strongholds that were both temple and hall, where warriors lived under the watch of their gods. When danger loomed, the villages vanished into these circles, and even the bravest raider found himself facing not huts of straw, but walls of oak and earth, built to endure siege and fire alike. The tribes who filled this land were many the Abodrites, the Veleti, the Rani, the Sorbs, each with its prince, its warriors, its sacred groves. Alone, they could be broken. Together, bound by language, blood, and a fierce devotion to freedom, they formed a confederation that rivaled kingdoms. Their strength lay not in a single crown, but in their unity of spirit and in their refusal to bow to any lord beyond their own gods. In their pantheon, Svantivit, the four-headed god of war and prophecy, gazed over sea and land alike, his temple at Arkona rising high above the Baltic waves. Warriors swore oaths beneath his gaze, and priests read the fates from his sacred white horse. To the Wends, battle was not only survival but sacrifice, each victory proof of divine favour, each death an offering that bound their land more tightly to their gods. And yet, their story is buried beneath centuries of silence, for the chronicles of Europe were written by their conquerors, the Saxons who sought their lands, the Danes who feared their raids, the priests who called them heathen. They were painted as savages, as pagans howling in forests, their victories diminished, their resistance forgotten. But the truth seeps through the cracks of history. These were warriors who shattered Viking raids, who drove back German lords, who defied Christian kings for centuries. The sagas do not tell of them, for the Norse remembered defeat as poorly as the priests remembered defiance. Yet, in the shadows of forgotten forests, among the ruins of their grodi, the echo still lingers. The Wends were no mere footnote to Viking power. They were the storm that halted it. The land of the Wends was no open field for kings to march upon, nor gentle shore where raiders might easily claim their prize. It was a labyrinth of forest and water, a country forged in secrecy and shadow. The Baltic wind swept across low coasts and river mouths, but once a man stepped inland, he was swallowed by endless green. Great oaks and beeches rose like pillars, their crowns knitting together until even the sun seemed banished. The air hung damp and heavy, filled with the musk of earth, the slow trickle of unseen streams, and the shifting whisper of leaves that betrayed no path. Here lay swamps that could drown an army in silence. Marshes spread for miles, their surfaces veiled in mist, their depths treacherous with sucking mud. Only the Wends knew the hidden causeways, the narrow tracks of solid ground woven through reeds and bog. To strangers, the land itself was a trap, luring them forward until horses stumbled, carts sank, and men vanished waist-deep in black water. Even in winter, when frost hardened the surface, Wendish hands broke ice in chosen places, leaving death disguised beneath a thin white crust. The rivers of this land were lifelines and barriers both. The Oder, the Elbe, the many smaller streams that coiled through forest and meadow, carried trade, fish, and life. But in times of war, they became moats that no host could easily cross. Shallows known only to the locals allowed swift passage, while outsiders floundered in uncertain currents. Bridges could be razed or burned, fords guarded by warriors who melted back into the trees when the battle turned. To the Wends, river and swamp were allies' fluid walls that shifted at will, confusing enemies who longed for open ground. Forests, too, were not merely wilderness, but weapons. The Wends shaped them with cunning. Trees were half felled and left standing, ready to be toppled with a push, crushing horse and rider. Pits gaped beneath carpets of leaves, sharpened stakes waiting at the bottom. Along narrow tracks, wooden idols of gods and ancestors stared with hollow eyes, unsettling intruders who already feared the silence. Wind chimes of bone clattered high in the branches, their eerie voices mingling with the distant howls of wolves. The Norse believed trolls lurked in such woods, and when Wendish horns bellowed from the shadows, the fear was made flesh. This homeland was not conquered with speed or fire, for every stride into it was contested by earth, water, and spirit. The Wends did not merely dwell in these marshes and forests, they were part of them. Each grove held memory, each swamp concealed vengeance, each river carried watchful eyes. To outsiders, Vendland was a maze of dread. To its people, it was a fortress that no king, no raider, no priest could truly master. It was their shield, their spear, and the silent power that made them unconquered for centuries. Across the marshes and dark forests of Vendland rose the Grody fortresses, unlike anything the Norse had ever seen. From afar, they appeared as earthen mounds crowned with timber, but as one drew closer, their cunning revealed itself. Massive ditches, filled with water from nearby rivers, ringed each site, while walls of oak logs, bound with clay, towered high above. These were not simple barricades thrown up in haste. They were circles of power, where warriors, priests, and craftsmen gathered under one roof of earth and wood, where the sacred and the martial lived as one. Within the Grod, narrow gates twisted like the throat of a beast, forcing any intruder to expose his flank before he could pass. Watchtowers of heavy timber loomed above these entrances, where bowmen waited with fire-tipped arrows and stones ready to fall. The walls themselves were wide enough for defenders to move in ranks, shields braced, spears poised to rain down. To storm such a fortress was to step willingly into a death trap, for every approach was designed to bleed an army before its first clash of steel. But these fortresses were more than bastions of war. At their centre stood wooden halls where the elders held council, where tribal assemblies were called, where the fate of alliances and battles was decided. Beside them rose shrines, adorned with carved idols of gods with many faces. Svantevit, with his 4 heads gazing to every horizon. Triglav crowned with 3 realms of earth, sky, and underworld. Offerings of grain, livestock, and captured weapons lay at their feet, proof that for the Wends, the gods walked hand in hand with warriors. In times of peace, the Grodi thrived as bustling centres of craft and trade. Blacksmiths forged iron spearheads, potters shaped decorated vessels, weavers worked bright cloth, and merchants carried goods from far coasts through their gates. Farmers from the countryside brought grain and honey, swelling the stores within the walls. In times of war, these same circles became sanctuaries, able to shelter whole villages. The ditches filled, the gates barred, the walls bristling with spears, the Grod transformed into a living shield. Arabs, Saxons, and Norse alike, who glimpsed them, spoke in awe. They build their strongholds in circles, one traveller wrote, with walls of timber and earth so thick that rams cannot break them, and with water surrounding them like a moat. To the Vikings, used to striking undefended coasts and villages that fled at first sight of their sails, these bastions were something new, unyielding, enduring, and ready. Every Grod was a statement carved into the land. Here we stand, and here we will not be moved. Fortress, temple, and heart of the people, they embodied Wendish strength. To topple one was not merely to capture a town, but to strike at the spirit of a tribe. Yet even when walls fell, the circle was raised anew. As long as the Grodi endured, so too did the Wends, unbroken in the face of sea kings and crusaders alike. In the heart of Wendish lands, war and worship were bound as tightly as sinew to bone. No sword was lifted, no raid embarked upon, without first seeking the will of the gods. To outsiders, their pantheon seemed strange and terrifying, faces upon faces, carved in wood, idols towering over groves and fortresses, their eyes painted to glimmer in the firelight. But to the Wends, these were not mere effigies. They were living powers whose breath stirred the forests, whose wrath shook the skies, whose favour alone could turn the tide of battle. Foremost among them stood Svantevit, the 4-headed god of war and prophecy. At Arkona, high upon the cliffs of Rugia, his colossal wooden idol gazed to every horizon. One face looked forward, one back, and 2 to either side, so that no enemy could approach unseen. In one hand he held a great horn, filled each year with mead or wine. Priests read the level of the liquid to foretell the harvest and the fate of coming wars. At his feet treasure piled high rings, weapons, silks, and coins, offerings from warriors and chieftains who sought his blessing. His sacred white horse was led across lines of spears before campaigns, its steps judged as omens of victory or ruin. When Norsemen came raiding, Wendish warriors believed they rode beneath Svantovit's gaze, his unseen hand guiding every arrow, every blow. Beside him stood Triglav, the three-headed god, master of sky, earth, and underworld. Black cloth veiled his faces in some shrines, for mortals were not meant to look upon his mysteries. To him, warriors swore oaths of loyalty, knowing that falsehood would curse them not only in this life but in all realms beyond. His presence reminded the Wends that every battle was fought not just for soil and kin, but for the very balance of the worlds. There was Perun, Lord of Thunder, whose storms split the sky and whose bolts struck down oath-breakers and cowards. His voice rumbled in summer clouds, his fury fell as lightning upon enemy ranks. To call upon Perun was to summon courage and fire in the blood, to face foes without fear, and there was Jiva, goddess of life and fertility, who brought grain to the fields and children to the hearth. Even as men marched to war, women prayed to her that their lineage would not be broken, that life would continue after blood was spilled. In this pantheon, the Wends found not comfort but strength. Their gods were fierce, demanding, ever-present, and in their many faces the people saw both the terror and promise of existence. To fight was to serve them, to die was to join them. And so each battle became more than a clash of spears, it was an offering, a ritual, a defence of sacred ground against those who dared defile it. For the Wends, the gods walked with them, and in that faith lay a power even the Vikings had reason to fear. The first longships came with the dawn, their dragon heads cutting through the mists of the Baltic. The Northmen had tasted rich prizes in Ireland, in Francia, and along the English coast. They expected the same here, scattered hamlets of frightened peasants, villages that would burn easily, and captives that would fetch high prices in the slave markets of Hedeby. Their sails swelled with confidence, for they believed the Wends would fall as quickly as the others. The shore before them seemed quiet, inviting, the forest still. Silver and glory felt already within reach. The Norsemen leapt from their ships, iron flashing in the pale light, laughter in their throats. They stormed the first settlements. They found clusters of thatched huts, farmers who scattered before their fury. The raiders plundered grain and livestock, torched roofs, and dragged prisoners to the sand. It was a familiar rhythm, a dance they had repeated across Europe. Yet in Vendland, the rhythm faltered. When the Vikings returned for their spoils, they found the village rebuilt within weeks, palisades rising higher, warriors waiting with bows strung tight. What should have been easy prey proved stubborn, resilient, and prepared. The Northmen pressed inland, seeking richer plunder. There they discovered the Grody, the circular strongholds hidden behind ditches and timbered walls. Unlike the monasteries of the west, these were no undefended sanctuaries. From ramparts, Wendish archers rained down arrows, while warriors surged through narrow gates in sudden counterattacks. The Vikings, famed for their shock and speed, found themselves halted, their long axes turned aside by walls and moats, their shield walls broken in marsh and mire. Still they returned, for the promise of Wendish wealth was too great. Chronicles speak of the raiders arriving in greater numbers, eager to crush resistance and claim dominance. But each time they came, the Wends were ready. Scouts tracked the longships. Smoke signals rose from hilltops. Horns bellowed across forests and rivers. Warriors could gather in a single day, answering the call of their princes and gods. What began as scattered defence soon hardened into a pattern the Norse could not break. One account tells of a raid driven back so swiftly that the sea itself became a graveyard. Longships were seized, their crews cut down on the shore, their captured dead offered to the gods. Another speaks of Norsemen caught in forest ambushes. where the trees themselves seemed to bleed warriors painted in red and white. Survivors fled back to the water, their fear greater than their shame. The Vikings had come seeking plunder, and found instead an enemy who refused to yield. The Wends were not like the kingdoms of the West, slow to rally and eager to buy peace with gold. They were bound to their land as roots to the earth, and every raid only sharpened their will. For the first time, the Northmen felt what others had long known, that terror was not theirs alone to wield. In Wendland, the hunters had stumbled into the lair of prey that bit back. Night in Wendland was never silent. When the fires burned low and the mist crept from the marshes, the forests came alive with sound. Chief among them was the howl of wolves, long and mournful, carrying across rivers and fields like a warning from the gods themselves. To the Wends, the wolf was no mere beast. It was a companion, a guardian, a creature of both terror and reverence. They saw in its eyes the spirit of the hunt, the shadow of ancestors, the untamed strength needed to survive. To the Norse who set foot in those forests, the howl became something darker, a voice that marked them as prey. The Wends were said to raise wolf cubs from the dens, taken young and fed by hand until they knew the scent of man as kin. These were no tame hounds, no obedient curs that bowed to leash and master. They remained half-wild, trained to answer only certain handlers, to attack with ferocity when loosed, and to guard the night with their piercing cries. Chronicles written by horrified Saxon priests tell of warriors leading wolves into battle on leather cords, the beasts snarling and snapping as drums thundered and horns blared. To the Norse, who believed wolves to be omens of doom, the sight of such beasts in the enemy's ranks struck deeper than spear or arrow. Legends grew of the wolf priests, men and women painted in ash and blood, cloaked in pelts with the beast's head still attached, their voices raised in chants that rose and fell with the howls. They were believed to command packs by gesture and whistle, guiding them through the woods like extensions of their will. In ambush, wolves were placed downwind of Viking horses, their scent enough to throw mounts into chaos, breaking shield walls before battle was even joined. Whether all of this was truth or terror, magnified by trembling survivors, hardly mattered. Fear itself was a weapon, and the Wends wielded it with mastery. Norse sagas rarely mention these encounters, but stray lines and foreign chronicles whisper of raiders who fled without battle, convinced they faced not men but spirits of the forest. For the wolf, in Wendish lore, was more than flesh. It was a symbol of the land's defiance, the very soul of a people who would not be broken. To march against the Wends was to march into a forest that breathed and hunted. Every howl in the distance could be a warning or a signal or a curse. To the Viking, it was the sound of death drawing near. And to the Wend, it was the voice of their gods, reminding them that they did not stand alone. In the clash of spear and axe, when fear gnawed at the hearts of invaders, it was often the wolf's cry, real or imagined, that broke them first. The first Viking sails had brought fire, and for a moment it seemed Wendland might be consumed. Villages fell, fields burned, captives were dragged away in chains. The Northmen struck fast and vanished on the tide, leaving only smoke behind them. Yet where others bent and broke, the Wends hardened. Each raid became a lesson, each wound a teacher. What the Vikings thought to be victories were only sparks that forged iron in the hearts of those they sought to conquer. When the ashes cooled, the villages rose again. Huts rebuilt, walls raised thicker, ditches dug deeper. What was taken was restored, and what was destroyed was remade stronger than before. The Norse learned to their frustration that burning a Wendish settlement was no end, it was an invitation to defiance. Priests blessed the new walls, warriors swore oaths over fresh-hewn timber, and children grew with the memory of flames etched in their eyes. Out of ruin, a fiercer generation was born. The Wends studied their enemies. They saw how the Northmen struck with speed, seeking fear and chaos before resistance could gather. So they built systems of warning watchfires on high hills, horns that carried across valleys, messengers who slipped through marsh and forest faster than any horse. Where once villages had been caught unprepared, now whole regions could rise within a day. The hunter's surprise was stolen from him, and the hunted became an armed host waiting in the trees. They watched how the Vikings relied on open ground for their shield walls, how their fury was most deadly in direct clash. And so the Wends fought on their own terms, dragging raiders into swamps, ambushing them in narrow passes, striking from cover before melting away. No great battle was needed to bleed the invaders. A handful of archers, hidden and patient, could turn victory into rout. A single false path leading into a bog could end a warband. In time, the fear that had once been the Vikings' greatest weapon turned against them. Tales spread of Norsemen vanishing into forests and never returning, of longships found abandoned, their crews cut down to the last man. What had begun as raids for plunder became wagers of survival. And still the Wends rebuilt, their grody standing firm, their villages thriving again, as if the land itself refused to yield. Through fire they had learned resilience. Through blood they had learned strategy. The Vikings had expected easy conquest, and found instead a people who grew sharper with every wound. The raids that once brought silver and slaves now brought only loss and dread. In Wendland, every torch lit by the Northmen became a beacon of vengeance, and every sword raised against the Wends forged new tactics that would one day drive even the fiercest sea kings back to their ships. The strength of the Wends did not lie in one king or one banner, but in the countless voices of tribes who refused to bow. Along the southern Baltic, the land was divided among peoples, with their own chieftains, their own gods, their own sacred groves. The Abodrites watched the western marches near the Elbe, standing as a shield against Saxon lords. The Veleti held the central rivers and forests, fierce and unyielding. The Rani, whose power rose from the island of Rugia, guarded the seas and the great temple of Svantivit. Inland, the Sorbs kept the highlands and dense woods, their warriors hardened by stone and soil. Dozens more smaller clans filled the marshes, the valleys, the islands. Alone they might have been overwhelmed. Together they became a storm. The bond between them was not that of empire. No crown ruled over all Wendland. No single prince commanded every sword. Each tribe remained sovereign, proud of its independence, jealous of its traditions. Yet when the threat of outsiders came, whether Saxon lords pressing from the west or Viking, sails blackening the horizon, the Wends remembered their common blood. Language, rites, and the shared worship of many-faced gods bound them as surely as iron binds chain. When danger threatened, councils were called in the Grodi. Princes and elders gathered, warriors at their sides, while priests read omens from fire and horse. Decisions were hammered out not by decree but by agreement, for no tribe would surrender its will. Yet from this debate came unity, and when the horn was blown, men answered from every corner of Wendland. A confederation rose, not fixed like stone, but living and shifting like the forests, themselves hard to grasp, impossible to break. The Norse, who dealt in kings and jarls, found this baffling. They sought to strike at leaders, to cut off the head and watch the body wither. But the Wends had no single head to sever. If one chieftain fell, another stepped forward. If one tribe was struck, its neighbours closed in around it. To crush the Wends entirely was like trying to extinguish a fire that leapt from log to log, never resting in one place. This confederation gave the Wends a resilience few enemies could match. One tribe could raid the Danes, while another resisted the Saxons, while yet another fortified the coast. No single blow could end them. Their strength lay not in rigid order, but in a web of kinship, faith, and shared defiance. So it was that a people without empire or king withstood both Vikings and Christian lords for centuries. The Abodrites, Veleti, Rani, Sorbs, and countless others remained many voices, yet one song, a song of resistance, fierce and unbroken, echoing across the forests and marshes of their homeland. On the windswept coast of the Baltic lies Wolin, an island whispered of in both Wendish tales and Norse sagas. To the Vikings it was a place of trade and temptation, a harbour where silver flowed and ships gathered. Yet beneath its soil lay a darker truth, a grave that tells not of riches won, but of warriors lost. For here, in a pit of bones, the silence of the earth has spoken, and it speaks of Viking defeat. In the 20th century, when the spades of scholars cut into Wolin's ground, they uncovered the remains of men who had perished violently around the year 850. There were nearly 40 bodies, heaped together as if cast aside after slaughter. The bones bore marks of battle sword cuts, cleaving skulls, spear wounds, piercing ribs, shattered limbs that told of desperate flight. Many wounds were to the back and legs, the kind struck not in the press of shield wall, but in the rout, when men flee and their enemies cut them down from behind. This was no burial of honour, no mound raised by kin. It was the grave of the beaten, left as testimony to the price of arrogance. Beside them lay fragments of their lives, iron rivets from longships, pieces of swords and axes, ornaments in the Scandinavian style. Yet mingled among them were Wendish arrowheads and pottery shards, tokens of the victors who stripped the dead of treasure before consigning their remains to the pit. The earth itself preserved the memory of that clash, long after the songs of skalds had chosen silence. The chronicles hint at such disasters. Helmold, the Saxon priest, wrote of Norse raiders who thought to plunder Slavic shores as they had elsewhere, only to be driven into the sea with great slaughter. Other accounts tell of ships captured, crews offered in sacrifice to Svantevit and Triglav. The bones at Wolin match these tales too closely to be chance. Here is proof that the Vikings, so feared across Europe, found in Wendland not prey but peril. To the Wends, this grave was not merely victory, it was warning. The Northmen had come with fire and hunger, expecting tribute, and they left in silence, their dead feeding the soil of a land they could not master. To the Norse who survived, the memory lingered like a curse, a tale better left untold around the hearthfire, for it spoke of shame. Even now, the pit at Wolin breathes its truth. Each bone is a fragment of history, each wound a reminder that the Viking name was not invincible. In the forests and fortresses of the Wends, they met warriors who fought not for plunder, but for gods, kin, and sacred ground. And in that clash, the feared became the fallen, buried in foreign earth, where only the whispers of the wind recall their fate. The forests of Wendland were not mere wilderness. They were warriors in their own right, sharpened into weapons by the hands of those who knew them best. To the Viking, used to open seas and swift strikes, these woods were a maze of dread, trees pressed close, blotting out the Sunday mist curled low, swallowing paths and twisting the sense of direction. And in that gloom, the Wends prepared a battleground where every step might be the last. Ambush was their craft. Paths that seemed safe gave way to sudden death pits, dug deep and hidden beneath branches, lined with sharpened stakes waiting for horse or man. Trails narrowed to choking points where raiders could march only two abreast, perfect places for arrows to fall like rain from unseen bowmen. Trees themselves became weapons, half-cut trunks left standing by a breath of wood, ready to topple with a push and crush warriors beneath their weight. To wander into these forests was to march into a trap designed not for a single battle, but for terror unending. Yet it was not only death the Wends sowed, but fear. Along the paths they set, carved effigies, grotesque wooden faces with gaping mouths and staring eyes. Painted red with blood, they caught the light in eerie ways, their shadows stretching like spirits among the branches. Skulls, both human and beast, were hung from trees, their empty sockets gazing down at intruders. Bones rattled in the wind, and crude chimes of wood and sinew filled the silence with whispers that seemed alive. To men already uneasy in the foreign dark, Such signs were curses carved into the very air. The Wends understood their enemy's heart as well as his flesh. They knew the Norse feared the forest spirits of their own sagas, trolls and draugr, that prowled in night silence. So they gave those fears a body, crafting sounds and sights that blurred the line between mortal foe and something otherworldly. Warriors entered the woods with iron in hand and courage in their chests, but as the hours passed, that courage thinned, gnawed by the sense of being watched, stalked, hunted. When the horns finally roared and the arrows struck, many had already broken in spirit. It was war not only of blade, but of mind. For every raider who fell to arrow or trap, another fled before unseen foes, certain that the forest itself had risen against him, and in truth it had. The Wends fought with more than spears and swords, they fought with earth, with shadow, with the howl of wolves and the silence of trees. To raid Wendland was to face not an enemy across a field, but an enemy that seeped from the land itself. The forest was their fortress, their ally, their weapon. In its depths, the Vikings found themselves not as hunters, but as prey. In Wendland, no sword was lifted without first consulting the unseen. The warriors of the Slavic tribes did not march blindly into battle, for theirs was a world where every tree held a spirit, every storm carried a warning, and every silence spoke of omens. At the heart of this faith stood the priests and seers, men and women cloaked in wolfskins, their faces painted in ash and blood, who guided the warriors as much with prophecy as with steel. To the Wends, these figures were not mere keepers of rites, they were the very voice of the gods. The sacred groves were their temples, dark and ancient clearings where no axe was dared to bite without ritual. Oaks stood like pillars of eternity, their bark carved with symbols of the divine. Here the priests read signs in the flight of birds, in the entrails of sacrificed animals, in the way smoke coiled toward the heavens. Before a raid, warriors gathered in these shadowed places, laying spears at the roots and offering grain, honey, or blood to the earth. There the wolf priests chanted, their voices rising with the distant howls of the beasts they revered, weaving man and animal into a single will. Divination was not idle superstition, it was law. A horse led across, laid spears, might foretell victory if it stepped clean, or doom if it faltered. Flames that sputtered, or smoke that curled against the wind, warned of treachery or defeat. Warriors entered the fight with conviction, because they believed the gods themselves had spoken. And belief, more than iron, was the sharpest edge they carried. The priests also steeled the mind of the host. They painted runes and symbols upon foreheads and shields, marking warriors as chosen of Perun, Svantavit, or Triglav. Potions brewed of herbs and mushrooms were drunk to stir frenzy, to banish fear and bring visions of ancestors marching beside them. Some fighters swore they heard the gods in their ears, urging them forward when the clash began. To enemies, such foes seemed possessed, fearless, almost inhuman in their fury. The wolf, sacred above all, bound this faith to the battlefield. Priests raised the beasts from cubs, taught them to howl at signal, and loosed them in rituals that blurred the line between omen and warcraft. A chorus of howls in the night could freeze a Viking band in terror, convinced that spirits prowled the woods. To the Wends, those howls were confirmation. The gods walked with them. In truth, the wolf priests and seers wielded no sword, yet their presence was as heavy as any warrior's shield. They gave order to chaos, courage to the fearful, and divine fire to the defiant. Through them, the Wends did not merely fight for land or tribe, they fought for the will of their gods. And so, each battle became a holy act, each death a sacrifice, each victory a sign that the forest and the heavens had spoken in their favour. For years the longships came like storms, striking Wendland's shores with fire and iron. Yet, by the middle of the 9th century, the tide had turned. The raiders, who had once been hunters, found themselves stalked, and the Wends, who had learned through fire and blood, now carried war across the sea. What began as defence sharpened into vengeance. The wolf that had crouched in the forest now leapt for the throat of its foe. Wendish warbands gathered on the coast, their ships broader and heavier than before, crafted not for flight, but for endurance in shallow waters where Viking keels could not follow. Painted warriors boarded them, faces marked with ash and ochre, their eyes set not on their own villages but on the settlements of the north. Priests blessed their voyage in sacred groves, spilling blood upon the soil and reading omens in the smoke. Horns sounded, and the sails caught the wind. Now it was the Vikings who would wake to fire. They struck first at the outposts, isolated farms along Danish shores, small trading posts built upon the promise of Norse mastery. The Wends came by night, slipping silently through rivers and inlets, their ships gliding like shadows. When dawn broke, barns smouldered, ships lay burning in their cradles, and corpses floated in the shallows. What the Norse had once inflicted upon others now fell upon them. Word spread quickly through Scandinavia. The Slavs had learned the sea. The great trading town of Hedeby trembled when Wendish fleets were sighted near its harbours. Chronicles speak of raids that swept across Danish coasts, where shipyards, those very lifelines of Norse power, were torched, leaving only blackened ribs of timber jutting from the shore like the bones of whales. What had once been the forge of Viking dominance became vulnerable, exposed to the same terror it had unleashed for decades. The shock cut deeper than the sword. The Norse were unused to being the prey. Their strength had always lain in surprise, in the swiftness of attack. Now they saw their own tactics mirrored back at them, their own fear reflected in the flames of their halls. A raider's life was meant to bring silver and slaves, not the terror of waking to the howl of foreign warriors on familiar soil. For the Wends, these raids were not only revenge, but declaration. They proved that they were no passive people clinging to marsh and forest, but a power that could strike outward, that could claim the sea as well as the land. The wolf had crossed the river and sunk its teeth into the heart of its enemy's home. In this turning of the hunt, the balance of the Baltic shifted. No longer could the Norse believe themselves untouchable. The Wends had become more than defenders. They were hunters now, and the Vikings, for the first time, knew what it was to be afraid. The Baltic was once the Vikings' dominion, their dragon-proud ships carving paths of fear across the sea. Yet the Wends, long thought bound to forest and marsh, learned to master the waves. They watched the raiders' vessels, studied their frames when wrecks washed ashore, and examined the captured ships dragged into their harbours. What the Norse had perfected, the Wends reshaped for their own designs. By the mid-9th century, the sea no longer belonged to the Northmen alone. Wendish ships were different from the slender longships that carried the raiders across oceans. Their hulls were broader, their draughts shallower, built to slip into rivers and coastal shallows where Norse keels could not follow. While Viking ships prized speed and reach, Wendish vessels were crafted for manoeuvre, able to pivot swiftly in narrow waters, to glide through reed-choked estuaries, and to turn ambush into slaughter. Warriors stood steady on their decks, bows in hand, shields braced against the rail, loosing volleys that rained upon enemies trapped in confined straits. They borrowed, but they also improved. Some Wendish ships carried removable rudders and centreboards, clever devices that allowed sudden reversals without turning broadside to the enemy. In battles fought in twisting inlets or among hidden shoals, such tricks proved fatal to the Norse, whose ships were designed for the long sweep of the open sea. The Wends turned the very geography of their coastlines into a net, drawing the hunters into waters where their prey already waited. When Wendish fleets struck, they did so with the same ferocity the Vikings once wielded. Shipyards burned, keels half-finished were toppled into flame, and the smoke of vengeance curled skyward. Norse trade routes trembled, for now the threat came not only from rivals across the sea, but from Slavic warbands who knew the coast as intimately as they knew their forests. Chronicles whisper of Danish ports, where merchants watched the horizon with dread, knowing that the next sail might not bring trade, but ruin. To the Vikings, this was an unthinkable reversal. The sea had been their shield, their greatest strength. Now it betrayed them. In narrow sounds and shallow bays, they found themselves hemmed in by foes who moved like shadows upon the water. Wendish archers filled the air with death before the clash of axe and spear ever began. Warriors painted for war boarded Norse ships, their cries rising with the howl of wolves carried across the waves. The Baltic became contested ground, its tides carrying not only dragon ships, but the wolf-proud vessels of the Slavs. For the first time, the Vikings felt the sea itself slipping from their grasp. The Wends had risen from the marshes to challenge them upon their own element, and the hunters of the ocean now found their mastery broken. The waves no longer carried Viking dominion alone, they bore the wrath of Wendland. Rugia rose from the Baltic, like a spearhead thrust toward the heart of Denmark. Its cliffs and harbours made it a natural fortress, and its forests hid shipyards where Wendish craftsmen shaped planks into vessels meant for war. More than an island, Rugia was the anvil upon which Slavic power struck, the place where sea and spirit joined to forge defiance. To the Danes, it was a constant thorn, a bastion of enemies who watched their coasts with hungry eyes. To the Wends, it was sacred ground, the heart of their confederation, and the seat of Svantovit himself. At Arkona, high above the crashing sea, stood the god's great temple. Its wooden idol towered with 4 faces, each gazing to a different horizon, watching every approach by land or wave. Priests kept the horn of prophecy filled with wine, reading its level to foretell harvests and wars. Beneath that gaze, warriors swore oaths and princes bound alliances. The sacred white horse was led over spears to divine the outcome of campaigns, and when its step foretold victory, the fleets of Rugia sailed with the fury of gods at their backs. From Rugia's harbours, Wendish ships swarmed like wasps, striking swiftly at Danish coasts and vanishing back into the mists. Traders who dared the southern Baltic did so under tribute, their wealth flowing not to Danish kings but to the priests of Svantovit. Danish shipyards smouldered, their halls plundered, while Rugian warbands feasted on the spoils. What was once thought a backwater of scattered tribes became the most dreaded island in the sea, a power that could not be ignored nor easily destroyed. Yet Rugia was more than a base of raids, it was a symbol. Its temple embodied the soul of the Confederation, uniting tribes who might quarrel elsewhere, but who bent together before the god of prophecy. To strike, Rugia was to strike not only at ships and warriors, but at the very heart of Wendish faith. The Danes knew this, which is why every raid they planned against the Slavs carried whispers of Arkona, the temple that loomed as a challenge and a curse. But each attempt to break it met with ruin, for the island was defended not only by walls and warriors, but by the conviction that their gods themselves walked its cliffs. So Rugia endured, year after year, a defiant spearhead that jabbed into the ribs of Denmark. Its fleets carried war north, its priests bound the tribes in unity, its temple reminded friend and foe alike that the Wends were no scattered people, but a nation forged in resistance. For the Danes, Rugia was a nightmare they could never forget. For the Wends, it was proof that they still stood unbroken, shielded by their gods and sharpened by the sea. The Vikings had built their terror upon the crash of shield walls, upon the fury of axe and sword breaking through towns before their foes could gather. Their strength lay in the sudden storm's swift landings, hard charges, the raw weight of shock that scattered farmers and monks alike. Yet against the Wends, this storm broke upon something it could not strike. The Slavs did not wait in neat ranks on open fields. They moved like shadows through forest and fen, their warriors light and unburdened, their strength in speed and silence. What the Norse called weakness became Wendish mastery. Wendish warriors wore little more than leather jerkins, their shields small and quick in the hand. They carried bows strung from horn and wood, javelins for hurling, and single-edged blades or axes for the final blow. Where the Norse clashed in heavy ranks, the Wends struck in waves. Arrows whispered first, loosed from thickets and ridges, cutting into shield walls from angles the Vikings could not guard. When the Northmen raised their shields high, javelins arced from the sides. When they turned to charge, the enemy was gone, vanishing into forest paths too narrow for formations, only to strike again from behind. The swarm was relentless. Small bands harried the flanks, others circled like wolves, never giving the raiders rest. A Viking warband might fight off one attack, only to find itself dragged into another, bled dry, before a true battle was even joined. The heavy iron of the Norse became their burden, their mail clinking loudly in forests that demanded silence, their long axes clumsy in the press of trees. The Wends chose the ground, and once chosen, the battle was already theirs. One account from a Danish chronicler speaks bitterly of how the Slavs attack like wasps, striking from every side, then fleeing, only to return when we give chase. Yet this was no cowardice, it was craft. Every retreat was measured, every feigned flight leading the Norse deeper into traps of mud, pits, and ambush. Horses stumbled, men broke formation, and the swarm closed in once more. To fight the Wends was to fight an enemy that was everywhere and nowhere, an enemy that turned every tree into a shield, every marsh into a wall. When finally forced to stand, the Wends did not meet the Vikings in equal ranks, but as hunters finishing a cornered beast. Archers loosed in volleys, wolves howled from the dark, and painted warriors rushed in from all sides. What had once been the terror of Europe now found itself swallowed by silence, cut down not in glorious battle but in the slow, choking grip of a people who fought as the land itself fought. The swarm broke the storm. The Vikings, who had thrived on surprise, found themselves outmatched by those who had made ambush an art. Against Wendish tactics, brute force meant little. It was not the clash of two armies, but the devouring of one by many, until even the fiercest Norseman learned that in these forests he was no hunter at all. The Wends did not fight a single enemy. While the dragon ships pressed upon their coasts, another threat gnawed at their western borders. From the valleys of the Elbe and beyond marched the Saxons and their German lords, driven by hunger for land and the blessing of priests who saw the Slavs as heathens fit for conquest. Thus the Wends lived between hammer and anvil raiders from the sea and armies from the plains. Two fronts that demanded constant vigilance, two storms that never ceased. The Saxon threat was older, rooted in the slow push of Germanic settlers and the ambitions of Frankish kings. Even before the Norse prowled the Baltic, warbands from the west tested Wendish borders, burning villages, seizing fields, dragging captives into bondage. With the rise of the Carolingians, the pressure only grew fiercer, sanctified by Christian banners. To the Saxon lords, the Wends were not only rivals but unbelievers, and their conquest promised both land and the favour of God. Yet the Wends met them, as they met the Vikings, with cunning and defiance. The Abodrites, dwelling closest to the Saxon marches, bore the brunt of these invasions. Their grodi became bastions against armoured knights, their marshes traps for cavalry that bogged and drowned. Where Viking raids were sudden and wild, Saxon attacks were slow, heavy, and relentless. Armies grinding forward with supply trains and priests at their side. The Wends learned to bleed them with swarming raids, cutting off food, harassing scouts, vanishing into forests before a counterstrike could land. But this war on two fronts tore deep. When fleets threatened from the Baltic, warriors were pulled from the western marches, leaving villages exposed. When Saxon lords advanced, fewer men stood ready to watch the coasts. Some tribes bent under the strain, swearing oaths to one side or the other in search of survival. At times, Abodrites allied with Franks to resist Norse raids. At others, They bent to Danish kings to shield themselves from the Saxons. It was a dance of necessity, a shifting game of survival in a land caught between rival powers. Still, the heart of Wendland endured. No matter the alliances made or broken, no matter the fields taken or rebuilt, the Wends clung to their independence. They fought not only for soil, but for their gods, their groves, their way of life. The Saxons could raise crosses above conquered lands, and the Vikings could leave ashes on the coast, but the spirit of the Slavs remained unbroken. To live in Wendland was to live with the constant sound of horns, from sea or from plain, never knowing which enemy would strike first. Yet it was in this crucible that their resilience was forged. Surrounded by wolves, the Wends learned to bear their own fangs, and between Norse raiders and Saxon lords, they became a people whom neither could easily crush. The summer of 983 rose like a storm from the forests of Wendland. For decades, the Germans had pressed eastward, building churches where groves once stood, raising stone keeps where Grodi had watched the rivers. Missionaries came with crosses, Saxon lords with swords, each claiming the land in the name of Christ and empire. Many thought the Wends bent, that they would crumble as others had before the might of the German Reich. But beneath the weight of tribute and the shadow of churches, anger smouldered like coals beneath ash. When the spark came, it burst into fire that would shake all of Europe. The revolt began with sudden fury. German garrisons along the Elbe were overwhelmed. Their walls stormed before messengers could flee. Priests were dragged from their altars, their churches pulled down, their bells silenced forever. The Wends struck in every quarter at once, not as scattered tribes, but as a confederation bound in vengeance. From the Sorbs of the uplands to the Rani of Rugia, war bands rose like a tide. Villages that had been forced to pay tribute now fed armies that swept across the borderlands. The cry went up, no more foreign lords, no more foreign gods. The Germans were caught unprepared. Their emperor lay dead, his heir but a child, their strength scattered across distant frontiers. Into this weakness the Wends poured their wrath. Churches that had taken years to raise were put to the torch in a single night. Missionaries who had boasted of baptizing villages were slain, their blood staining the stones they had blessed. Monasteries, with their hoarded wealth, were plundered, their treasures offered to Svantevit and Triglav in thanksgiving. Chroniclers in Saxony wrote with horror of the rising. They spoke of Slavic hosts so vast they seemed to spring from the very earth, of banners painted with wolves and gods, of warriors howling as they burned Christian strongholds to the ground. One priest, spared to spread the tale, declared that the devil himself must have led the Slavs. So sudden and complete was their fury. To the Wends it was no devil, but their gods reclaiming what had been stolen. For a brief, blinding moment, the dream of German conquest in the east collapsed. The border fortresses were ash, the marches emptied, and the Elbe once more flowed as the edge of empire. Across Europe, princes whispered of the disaster. If the Saxons could not tame the Wends, who could? The revolt was more than a rebellion. It was a declaration that the Slavic Confederation would not bow to Rome, to Saxony, or to any crown. The Great Rising of 983 proved that Wendland was no conquered land, but a nation still fierce, still free. The fire of that summer did not merely burn churches. It seared itself into memory, a warning to kings and emperors alike. Here dwelled a people who would fight to the last grove, the last marsh, the last stone of their fortresses before yielding their gods or their freedom. The clash between the Wends and their enemies was never only of steel and fire. Beneath every raid and rising beat a deeper war, the struggle of gods against gods, of a pagan confederation holding fast against the spreading shadow of Christendom. Where the Northmen came for plunder, the priests of Saxony and the lords of the empire came for souls. Between them, the Wends stood defiant, their sacred groves as important as their fortresses, their idols as vital as their spears. To conquer their land was to conquer their faith, and that was a prize the Wends would never surrender. The Christian kings sought more than tribute. They raised churches at the edges of Wendland, stone symbols of a new order meant to outlast fire and sword. They sent missionaries who preached of one God, denouncing Svantevit, Triglav, and Perun as demons. Baptisms were forced upon chieftains with the promise of peace or the threat of death. Yet, behind the walls of the Grodi, the old rites endured. Priests still read omens in the step of the sacred horse. Blood still spilled upon the earth in sacrifice. The Wends knelt only to their many-faced gods, and in that refusal lay their defiance. Against the Vikings, too, they stood apart, for though the Northmen worshipped their own pantheon, raids showed no respect for Slavic sanctuaries. To a Norse raider, the idol of Svantevit was no more sacred than a gilded cross, only treasure to be stripped and burned. Thus the Wends fought on two fronts, against the hammer of Christendom that sought to break their spirits, and against the axe of the Northmen that sought to plunder their homes. What gave them strength was the union of tribe and faith. Unlike the kingdoms of their foes, bound by kings and lords, Wendish unity came from their gods. Councils of princes began with sacrifice. War hosts moved only after divination. A victory was never just survival, but proof that the gods walked with them. A defeat was not shame, but a sign of omens misread, a lesson for the next struggle. This unshakable belief made them resilient beyond measure. To men who thought themselves favoured by heaven, it seemed madness. To the Wends, it was certainty. And so, while Christian kings raised crosses on their borders, while Norse jarls dreamed of Wendish slaves, the tribes of the southern Baltic clung to their pagan fire. The groves whispered with chants, the idols drank offerings, and the white horse of Arkona stamped its hooves as though mocking the march of empire. The Wends fought not merely for land, but for the right to live as they always had, bound to their gods and their soil. In that defiance, they became more than an obstacle. They became a living barrier, a confederation of tribes whose very faith was a fortress, holding back both raiders and kings alike. Hedeby was the jewel of the north, the beating heart of Viking trade. Ships from every sea crowded its harbour, their decks heavy with silver, silk, amber, and slaves. Merchants haggled in many tongues, and the wealth of half the world passed through its gates. To the Norse, Hedeby was more than a town. It was the lifeline of their power, the place where raiding turned into riches. Yet even this proud hub could not escape the reach of Wendish vengeance. From across the Baltic came fleets painted for war, their prows carved like wolves, their warriors sworn to leave Hedeby trembling in smoke. The Wends struck not to seize trinkets, but to shatter the very spine of Norse wealth. Their ships glided into the fjord before dawn, sails lowered, oars silent, the mist cloaking their approach. Then the horns sounded, harsh and deep, and the harbour erupted in fire. Arrows fell on moored ships, torching their hulls before they could push off. Warriors leapt onto the piers, their cries rising with the howl of wolves, cutting down merchants who scrambled for safety. Where once Viking raiders had torched foreign markets, now their own proud emporium felt the same wrath. Hedeby's defenders rallied, but they found themselves facing a foe who had learned their craft too well. The Wends did not blunder into shield walls. They harried the streets in swift bands, loosing volleys from doorways, vanishing into alleys, then striking again from behind. Fires spread quickly, consuming warehouses stacked with goods from the east. Smoke rolled over the harbour, and beneath it, Wendish hands seized silver, tools, and captives. By the time the Danes gathered in strength, their foes were already gone, their sails lost in the sea mist, leaving only charred timbers and ruin behind. But the raid was more than plunder, it was message. Hedeby's power rested not on its walls alone, but on the belief that it was safe, that trade could flourish under the shadow of Norse mastery. The Wends ripped that illusion apart. Merchants whispered of the Slavic fleets, of warriors who struck like spirits and vanished with the tide. Some traders began to avoid Hedeby altogether, preferring Wendish markets where tribute was owed but safety more certain. The lifeblood of silver and goods began to trickle elsewhere, and in that trickle lay the slow weakening of Viking dominance. For the Danes, Hedeby's burning was more than loss, it was humiliation. To be raided as they had raided others cut deep, and the memory of wolf-proud ships searing their harbour lingered long after the flames were quenched. The shadow of Hedeby stretched across the Baltic, not as symbol of Viking power, but as a reminder that the Wends had risen from forest and marsh to strike at the very heart of Norse wealth. The hunters of the seas had found their prey armed and merciless, and in the ashes of their own emporium, they tasted what it meant to be vulnerable. In the tangled web of the Baltic, enemies and allies were never fixed. The Wends, caught between the crushing weight of the German Reich and the prowling longships of the Northmen, learned quickly that survival was not only won with sword and spear, but with the turning of oaths. Thus it was that yesterday's raider might become today's brother-in-arms, for necessity bent pride, and vengeance could wait when a greater threat loomed. The Germans pressed ever eastward, building churches on Wendish soil, raising fortresses along the Elbe, demanding tribute and conversion. Their knights rode in armour the Slavs could not easily pierce, their banners borne with the blessing of Christ. Against such weight, even the fiercest tribes knew they could not always stand alone. And so eyes turned northward to Denmark, to the very people who had once torched their coasts and dragged their kin away in chains. At first it seemed unthinkable. How could the wolf clasp hands with the serpent? Yet the Danes, too, felt the tightening grip of the Germans, their kings wary of Frankish power pressing from the south. Better, then, to have Slavic spears at their side than against them. Envoys crossed the sea, bearing gifts and guarded words. Feasts were held where once there had been only raids. Oaths were sworn before idols and crosses alike, fragile pacts sealed with shared enemies in mind. In these moments of alliance, Wendish and Danish ships sailed together, their sails blotting out the horizon, their warriors united in harrying Saxon coasts. Chronicles tell of Slavic warbands fighting beside Danes against German marches, their arrows cutting down knights while Danish axes hacked through shields. For a time, the sea that divided them became a bridge, and the blood of common foes bound them closer than memory of past raids could divide. Yet, such bonds were never without suspicion. The Wends remembered the fires set by Danish hands, the plunder carried north. The Danes remembered the wolves that had howled outside Hedeby, the Slavic fleets that turned their own terror against them. Trust was thin, like ice over a river, strong enough to bear for a season but always threatening to break. Still, for those years, the alliance gave both peoples strength. It checked the advance of the Germans, slowed their reach, and reminded Saxon lords that the Baltic was no prize to be seized without cost. And for the Wends, it proved that even the fiercest enemies could be bent to their will when the land itself demanded it. The shifting sands of alliance showed the world that Wendland was no mere victim of greater powers, but a player in its own right. They bent when they had to, struck when they could, and endured through both. For in the end, the Wends were bound not by loyalty to crown or king, but by the unbroken vow to remain free. And if that freedom meant clasping hands with yesterday's foe, so be it for tomorrow. The spear might just as easily be turned again. The tide that had long battered Wendland from many shores rose higher still in the 12th century, and with it came a storm unlike any before. The wars with raiders and kings had scarred the coasts. The German advance had pressed from the west, but now the weight of all Christendom was hurled against the Wends. The Wendish crusade was not born of hunger for land alone, nor of greed for slaves and tribute, but cloaked itself in the language of heaven. To the men who carried cross upon their banners, the Wends were not only foes, they were heathens to be scoured from the earth. It began with words spoken in far-off halls. At Mainz, at Rome, priests thundered against the stubborn Slavs who clung to their old gods, who still burned incense to Svantovit and Triglav, who raised temples where no church bell rang. The failure of the crusade to the Holy Land had left Christendom restless, and the gaze of its lords turned north. If Jerusalem could not be won, then at least the forests of the Elbe and Oder might be sanctified in blood. In the summer of 1147, the cross-bearers came. Danes, Saxons, Poles, even Germans from lands once burned by Wendish fire, gathered in fleets and hosts. No longer were the Danes uncertain allies, for now the lure of holy conquest bound them tighter than any oath of necessity. Their ships blackened the horizon, their knights rode eastward, and their priests promised forgiveness of sins for every Slavic throat cut and every grove destroyed. The Wends met them with the fury of a people who had fought for centuries to keep their faith and their homes. From Rugia to the Havel, warriors poured forth, not only to defend soil, but to defend the very breath of their gods. Temples were fortified like fortresses, groves guarded as though they were citadels. For in the Wendish soul, the war was not merely against men, but against the erasure of all they were. Battles raged along river crossings and in the marshy plains, but the Crusaders came with unrelenting weight. They tore down idols, razed churches on sacred sites, and slaughtered whole villages in the name of their Christ. The gods with many faces that had long shielded the Wends now watched as their followers bled and burned. Yet even beneath this flood, the fire of resistance did not die. Some tribes bent, swearing hollow oaths of baptism, only to rise in secret revolt once the Crusader hosts withdrew. Others held out in the depths of the forests, fighting with ambush and flame, making each step of conquest costly. The crusade from the north scarred Wendland as no other war had, but it also carved into memory the unyielding defiance of a people who refused to vanish quietly into the dark. Though the banners of the cross would fly from many Wendish fortresses thereafter, the spirit of those who had stood against all the north could not be wholly crushed. For even as the churches rose, the echoes of drums and the whispers of the old gods lingered in the woods, reminding all who passed that this land had once fought back with the wrath of a world betrayed. The winds off the Baltic carried the smell of salt and pine when the Danes set their gaze upon Arkona. High upon its white cliffs, the holy city of Rugia stood as the beating heart of Wendish defiance, its temple to Svantovit gleaming like a crown above the sea. For centuries, the four-faced god had looked out across the waters, guardian of warriors and keeper of fate. His temple was not just wood and stone, it was the soul of a people who had resisted Viking axe, Saxon iron, and German fire. To bring it down was to strike not at walls, but at the very marrow of Wendish spirit. In the summer of 1168, King Valdemar of Denmark and Bishop Absalon brought their crusading fleet to Rugia's shores. Their sails blotted the horizon, their priests preached the death of idols, and their swords gleamed with the promise of holy conquest. The Wends, hardened by centuries of war, gathered within Arcona's fortress, determined that if their gods must fall, they would fall amidst fire and blood. From the walls they hurled stones and arrows, while chants rose from the temple, calling upon Svantovit to blind the invaders, to break their will. But the Danes had learned patience. They did not rush the walls as Vikings once had. Instead, they laid siege, cutting the fortress off from sea and land. Days stretched into nights, and the stores within Arkona began to dwindle. Fear gnawed at the hearts of the defenders, as the flames of their watchfires shrank. At last, betrayal from within sealed their doom. A section of the palisade caught fire, whether from enemy trickery or Wendish desperation, and through the smoke the Danes surged like a tide. The temple of Svantovit was stormed. Its four-faced idol, carved with majesty and fed for generations with offerings of mead, grain, and horseflesh, was dragged out into the light. Before the eyes of the people, the Danes split it apart with axe and torch, its sacred wood cast to the fire. The holy banners and treasures that had been offerings to the god were seized, carried off as spoils to foreign lands. Where once stood the greatest temple of the Slavs, only smoke and ash remained. The fall of Arkona was more than the conquest of a city, it was the shattering of Wendish independence. With Svantovit's face turned to cinders, the tribes of Rugia bent beneath the cross, and the last great pillar of pagan defiance crumbled. The conquerors raised churches on sacred ground, and the songs of the old gods were silenced by the toll of foreign bells. Yet, in the whispers of the forest, and in the memory of the people, Arkona's fire burned on. Though the temple was gone, the tale of its fall carried the weight of a people who had fought, resisted, and only yielded when the heavens themselves seemed torn from their grasp. Arkona's ashes marked the end of an age, but also the beginning of legend. The forests that once hid Wendish spears still whisper with their memory. Though Arkona burned and Svantovit's idol fell to ash, the Wends did not vanish like smoke on the wind. Their blood runs still in the sorbs of Lusatia, their songs linger in half-forgotten ballads, and their fortresses lie buried beneath mounds of earth and moss, waiting like sleeping giants beneath the trees. Each ruin is a scar upon the land, a silent reminder that these were a people who did not bow easily, who taught even the feared Vikings that conquest was never certain. Their resistance carved deep grooves in the story of the North. The Wends had been the shadow that stalked the raiders, the hand that struck from swamp and forest, the flame that turned back fleets. They forced the Norse to bleed for every gain, to reckon with an enemy that fought with patience, cunning, and a will as unyielding as the marshes that guarded their homes. In truth, their defiance hastened the turning of the age, for as the Northmen spent their strength on Wendish coasts, the dawn of kings and kingdoms rose behind them, reshaping Europe into realms too organized for raiders to easily plunder. The faith that once bound the Wends to their gods did not die without a trace. Folklore carried fragments of Svantovit and Triglav, of the wolf priests and the omens in the trees. In Slavic tales, white horses still appear as bringers of fate. Forests remain haunted by the echoes of ancestral guardians, and rivers are spoken of as living spirits that guard their people. What priests and kings sought to erase with cross and fire survived in the murmur of stories passed from mother to child, campfire to hearth, down through the centuries. The Vikings themselves could not escape the mark of the struggle. The sagas that thunder with tales of conquest grow strangely silent when it comes to Wendland, as if the skalds chose not to sing of defeats, or of the tribes who turned hunters into hunted. Yet absence is its own testimony, for in that silence lies the truth that these Slavic warriors were a foe too fierce to glorify, too stubborn to forget. Even now, when the wind sighs through the Baltic pines, it carries the same voice that Wendish seers once claimed was the gods themselves. It is an echo of defiance, of a people who refused to be erased. Though kingdoms fell, though crusades burned their shrines and levelled their Grodai, their struggle shaped the bones of Europe. The Norse age waned, the Saxons spread, and Christ's cross rose over the land, but the memory of the Wends endures. In their defiance lies a truth carved deeper than time, that even the mightiest invaders can be broken by the will of those who refuse to yield. The forest remembers, and through it, so does history.